Ever heard of a Yamaha B200? Jeremy Parker here, and my guess is you probably haven't. The B200 was not a popular keyboard here in the US, but this entry-level FM synthesizer was my very first synth, circa 1988, and it's made a cameo or two in my previous videos, including my recent Amiga 500 restoration project. Prior to that, it sat in its case unused for years, and if I was honest with myself, I wondered if I'd really want to use it again, or if I was just keeping it for sentimental reasons. This didn't need restoration per se, so why a video on the Yamaha B200 now? Well, after replacing the internal battery, which had died many years ago, it was a blank slate, and so I programmed a bunch of new patches across a sonic palette that ended up being pretty compelling. In the process, I've learned a lot about FM synthesis, and I think I've made the B200 relevant again, in a way rescuing it. While the factory sounds are fairly generic, drenched in effects, and not especially useful for my current needs, I've been really digging these new sounds I made. For a completely digital synth, I was really surprised by the warmth and fatness that was possible. In fact, the music in this video is from the B200, and my performance coming up features a couple of my favorite new patches. And for anyone out there who happens to have a B200 or compatible synth, I've made my sound bank freely available for download. But first, what the heck is this thing, and what does it sound like? The year was 1988, and the Yamaha DX line of synthesizers was nearing the end of its reign of dominance. As an answer to FM synthesis, Roland had released their flagship D50 the year before, and it quickly became an instant classic with its linear arithmetic synthesis. Of course, Korg was quick to respond with the iconic M1, also in 1988, which was to go on to become the best-selling synthesizer ever. So these were exciting times, and as a young kid watching MTV and hearing all these synthesizers on my favorite music, it just seemed like technology was making leaps and bounds. Meanwhile, back in Japan, Yamaha wanted to broaden their market with synthesizers that were geared more towards beginner and intermediate players, so they came up with the EOS series that was released mostly in Japan. EOS stood for Entertainment Operating System, and even the aesthetics were purposely chosen to diverge from the look of existing professional keyboards. Being significantly more expensive than the Portasound line, models like the B200 featured MIDI connectivity, quarter-inch outputs, and a high-quality two-way stereo speaker system with an impressive 20 watts per channel. There were even stereo quarter-inch inputs to allow you to use the internal speakers with another synth or drum machine. The Yamaha B200 was 8-note polyphonic, 8-part multi-timbral, and it had built-in digital effects and an 8-track sequencer, making it one of the first workstations of the era. The keyboard featured a unique spherically shaped pitch bend and modulation wheel, and 61 velocity-sensitive keys with aftertouch. Internally, the YS200 was identical, other than missing the built-in speaker system, but it featured a very different-looking industrial design. The TQ5 was the sound module version of the B200 and the YS200, with yet another interesting visual design. The synthesis engine itself was a 4-operator FM type based on the Yamaha YM2414 IC and was common to the DX11 and TX81Z, among others. The YM2414 had 8 voices with 8 possible FM algorithms. Although the DX7, for example, had 6 operators and a lot more available algorithms, the waveforms were limited to sine waves only. But the YM2414 offered not only a sine wave for the operators, but 7 additional waveform types with varying levels of harmonic complexity. Since both carriers and modulators could themselves use any of these 8 waveforms, the sounds could quickly become harmonically rich and detailed. However, due to the simpler interface and design aesthetic of the B200, not all the power of the YM2414 was directly accessible to the user. For example, there was no init patch, and no way of choosing the FM algorithm or many of the other parameters that were baked into the existing sounds. Waveform type, feedback, LFOs, and simple envelopes over the tone and volume were adjustable, but essentially a new sound could only be created by editing an existing factory sound. I had a hunch as a kid when I saw the DX7 patches in my keyboard magazine that my B200 wasn't letting me get at everything that was under the hood. But I didn't discover until the making of this video that editor librarian software for other synths, also using the YM2414, could work to program the B200 and get at some of the core FM parameters. So let's take a quick tour of the Yamaha B200 and see what this thing sounds like. Okay, so let's take a look at the front panel of the Yamaha B200. First off, you've got your power button, your volume control. Then you've got a fairly nice backlit LCD display and a row of buttons beneath it that typically correspond to some parameter that's in the display. Below that, you've got another row of function buttons that also serve as the track select for using the sequencer, which is an 8-track sequencer. On the right side, you have a numeric keypad, and the overall layout is actually fairly nice, I think. The sounds in the Yamaha B200 are organized in up to 3 banks of 100 patches each: the preset bank, the user bank, and the card slot if you have a card, and I actually do have a card installed. The preset bank by default, or from the factory I should say, is duplicated in the user bank. So when you want to create a sound, you're basically editing or modifying or overwriting one of the factory sounds. For example, this warm ensemble sound. I modified to create this sound I call Profit. Added a little aftertouch there. Without getting too far into details, I'll show you how I might edit a sound like this. So going back to the factory sound, the first thing I might do is just take off the effects, because although some of them sound okay by today's standards, I don't know, they're not quite doing it for me, but it also lets me hear the pure sound that much easier. So I would do that first, then I'd go over to tone, the tone page, which lets you adjust these 3 things here. Brilliance is really the modulator output level. Although you don't know the algorithm or how many modulators versus carriers you have, it basically does what it says. It makes the sound more brilliant. Then the wave is letting you choose the interval between the carrier and the modulator. Then the input 4 numbers is letting you choose any of the 8 waveforms for each of the carriers. But again, or I should say operators, but again, since you don't know which number is a carrier and which number is a modulator or what the algorithm is, you just kind of have to mess with it and just experiment. Then I would probably go to the envelope page, e.g. envelope generator. And here is again kind of an approximation of the envelope or grouping of the envelopes across the operators. So you have volume and tone with attack, decay, and release. So you can make the volume and the tone together attack more quickly. You could take away the release. Now, if you wanted to just work on the volume and not really affect the tone, you could do that sort of thing. So it gives you some control, and you can separate kind of the fundamental tones from the overtones in that way. But again, it's not like having individual envelopes for each operator. Then going to LFO, that's fairly self-explanatory, but it doesn't let you get at the delay parameter. In edit, you can get access to the feedback. So if the algorithm has feedback on any of the operators, that basically increases that feedback level. I'm probably not hearing it here. And that is basically it from a high level as far as what you can do to edit the sound. It is a little bit limiting, but surprisingly, I was able to get a lot of cool sounds just using the interface like it is. Okay, the last feature I want to talk about is the multi-mode. And this lets you select up to 8 different voices and either layer them or split them across the keyboard, or have different voices being accessed by different MIDI channels in the case of using an external sequencer like I used to do back in the day. But it's also very handy for performance because you can take a sound that you like, for instance, this one I made, and you can layer it on itself. What I've done is I've put one instance of the voice panned hard left, one pan to the right, and then I've detuned each voice down and up. And what you end up getting is a much fatter, wider sound. So that compared to now, of course, the downside is you're going to lose polyphony. So in this case, now I only have 4-note polyphony, but if you're prepared for that and you're using it for a lead sound, it works great. And in fact, I use it in the performance at the end of the video, so stay tuned for that. With all that in mind, let's hear the Yamaha B200 in context. Here's an original tune that was completely inspired by a 35-year-old digital synth, but in the style of funk that I'd be most likely to play nowadays. As I mentioned before, the access to the FM parameters was limited in the B200 due to the user interface, and I ultimately discovered a free editor librarian based on the controller platform, meant for the Yamaha TX81Z, that does let you get at all the core FM parameters. I won't go into the details here or try to give a tutorial on FM synthesis, but it may be a topic for a future video. Lastly, I'll mention again that my sound bank here can be downloaded for free as a sysx file and can be used with any of the compatible synths. If you happen to use Reaper as your DAW, you can also get my RIA bank file that makes calling up patches over MIDI much more convenient. It's almost like a poor man's VST for controlling a connected synth over MIDI from within the DAW, much like I use the Polybrute and its VST plugin. Check all the information and details down in the description. So I hope you've enjoyed this look at a fairly rare and quirky FM synth from the 80s that has recaptured my heart now in the 2020s. And I'll see you in the next one.